Hello again, students. Professor Watts here. Today we're going to talk about supply side economics. So, when we think about what we want out of our economic policy from the government, well, I would say this. Most of us would say we want more products, we want them to be cheaper, and we want them to be better over time for all possible goods and services, for all the things that we want to acquire that make our lives better every day: food, energy, clothing, entertainment, education, transportation, what have you. So let's think about this really simply in terms of supply and demand. Now, I've got just generic good X. It could be anything, right? Name the product you're interested in having more of. I'm interested in having more like sirloin steaks because they're kind of expensive and I'd like to have them maybe once a week instead of once a month. Okay. You might want a luxury car, right? You might want a nicer house, better entertainment system, whatever you want, in order for it to be more accessible and for more of it to be made available to the average consumer. Well, when we're looking at supply and demand, it's going to be obvious. What do we need to shift here? Do we need to shift the demand curve or the supply curve? Answer: shift the supply curve to the right, and we will move from an equilibrium. Let's label this right here, A, with this price and this quantity. And if we shift that supply curve to the right, we'll move to this equilibrium here. Let's call that B. And of course, the price will fall and the quantity will increase. Okay. And what would happen if we just over time just kept shifting supply curves out to the right? Well, price would fall and quantity would go up. And that's, if you look at like the long-term history of commonplace products, that is exactly what has been happening through capitalism, through the competitive market process over time. Products start off as expensive and only accessible to kind of rich people, but because the supply curve shifts right, costs of production go down, they become more and more commonplace, more and more accessible. Cost in real terms gets lower and lower, or I should say the price in real terms gets lower and lower, so that the average person can eventually afford it. Okay, so that's kind of the core insight, and I hope you can see that it's a very simple insight. It's just very basic applied econ principles, micro econ here, supply and demand. So when we kind of zoom out and then look over into the economic policy realm, into the macroeconomics realm, it's going to be a matter of thinking about what can government do in general to encourage that rightward shift of the supply curve over time. Well, we have a rubric for this as well, right? And this takes us back again to principles micro, which we reviewed a little bit early on in this course. So that would be the determinants of supply, of course. And if you took this class with me, or I think we covered this in at the beginning of Econ 202, we of course have our little rubric for that, which is T-TEP number, technology, taxes, expectations, price of inputs, number of producers. So then it becomes a simple question to ask, well, when we're talking about government policy, which of these can government policy influence directly? And this shouldn't be a hard question to answer. That's obviously taxes, because government sets tax rates and creates tax policy. So the question is, what would we want the government to do with respect to taxes, tax rates, tax policy, the structure of taxation, etc., in order to promote a rightward shift of the supply curve? And that answer should be easy as well. The government should make tax rates lower, should make compliance with tax systems easier. And doing some combination of that would reduce the overall cost of taxation to businesses, to consumers, and it would end up shifting the supply curve to the right. So we'll focus really strongly on how that works out here in a minute. I just want to mention something else, so we can think about policy can influence some of these things indirectly as well. And that would be things like, well, we could maybe have the government help promote research and development of new technologies, or implement incentive programs to help encourage people in businesses, inventors, to discover and apply new technologies. So we have the policy along those lines with intellectual property protection. So you could call those supply side policies as well, because ultimately, if we increase technology, we're shifting the supply curve to the right. So those would be labeled supply side policies as well. We could also look for government policies to promote competition, to promote production of natural resources, which are going to be the inputs into a lot of goods. I mean, if you think about energy resources in particular, you name me a product that doesn't use energy as an input. So if we promoted more affordable energy or more expansive energy production, that could influence the supply curve of all goods through the price of inputs channel. We could also think about reducing the regulatory burden on companies. All of those factors would work through either the price of inputs and or the number of producers. So I would kind of call this combination of things here supply side policies as well, but they operate in a more indirect fashion. We're going to focus in the remainder of this lecture on that big direct thing, which is the tax question, because that's when we think about supply side economics, broadly speaking, tax policy is going to be always the main element in supply side economics. When it comes to thinking about the U.S. government at the federal level and the impact of tax policies, we'll focus on the individual income tax, which is responsible for the bulk of federal revenue. Let's just remind ourselves how that tax system works in the United States. It's a progressive, highly progressive income tax, meaning as your income goes up, the tax rate you pay, the percentage you pay on additional income you earn, goes up as well. So what this means in a progressive system, and this is very intentional, is that your high income earners pay the bulk of the tax payments. And I'll show you data on that here in just a minute. But first of all, let's just look at how the tax brackets are currently structured. I'm recording this in May 2024. And here's how our tax brackets are structured as of 2017, when President Trump implemented his kind of tax plan. We'll talk about that more in a second. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was called the TCJA of 2017, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 brackets or tax rates. The way this works is that your first chunk of income is always exempt from taxes. If you're filing, and that amount will depend on whether you're filing singly or jointly or head of household or so on. So you've got an exemption of a certain amount of income, and then any income above and beyond that, you pay 10%. And then once you get up to the next bracket, you pay 12% on that amount of money. And then once you get past this, you pay 22% on this amount of money. Once you get past this, you pay 24%, and so on. So you can see that the top bracket, and a lot of supply side analysts will kind of focus on the top bracket because you can look at the top bracket and that kind of characterizes the progressivity or the steepness or the burden of the tax system overall. That 37% tax bracket only applies once you're earning above $609,000. Okay, so when we talk about taxes paid by the super high income people, a lot of your pro athletes or your big name entertainers or business executives, people like that who are earning millions of dollars a year, they are paying 37% on probably the vast majority of their income. Because if we're talking about a football player or basketball player or famous singer or actor, those people make millions of dollars. The vast majority of that is going to be taxed at 37%. High income people are paying pretty significant tax rates on the bulk of their income. Lower income, middle class people, down in these ranges here, they're probably paying, something in the 20s on the bulk of their income. So high income people pay the vast majority of the taxes. Now let's look at the exact data on that. This is from the Tax Foundation, very reliable data. Unfortunately, this data takes a while to compile, so we only have this as of 2021, but the patterns and structure of this will be pretty similar year to year. So we're looking at earners in this top column. We're looking at the top 1% of all earners, the top 5, 10, 25, the top half, the bottom half. Okay, look what the top half and bottom half pay just in terms of the share. This is what I want to focus on, the share of all taxes paid. The top half of people are paying basically all of the tax, about 98%. And the bottom half of people are only paying just a little bit, 2.3% of all the taxes. Okay? But this will get more and more concentrated. We go to the top 10%, they're paying 76% by themselves. So that means 10% of the people are paying 76% of the taxes. Look at just the top 1%. These would be your multi-million dollar earners, and they by themselves are paying almost half, 46% of all the taxes paid. Okay, and you can see that the number for that is given here as well. That's about this is in millions, so that's $1 trillion. The top 1% of income earners are responsible for $1 trillion of taxes paid to the government. The bottom half of earners are responsible for 51 million, almost nothing. It's a pittance. Okay, so this is tilted towards hitting the high income earners really hard compared to the low income earners. Now, it's kind of a political argument, and it's always going to be a question of how much is enough or too much. And that's kind of going to be based on your political value judgments, right? Because you'll hear people on the left say the rich should pay their fair share, and they don't think this is enough. They don't think this is fair. They might want those tax rates to go up, those tax brackets to go up on higher income. People on the right might say the rich are already paying more than their fair share, so they might want a flattening of the tax structure, the tax rates. Right, so this is a very informative table, though. This is just the data, right? Whether this is fair or good or bad, right or wrong, that economics can't answer those questions, right? It's value-free science. But here's the data, and you can plug this in, or you can apply your values to this and decide whether you like it or not. But these are just the facts. This is just the numbers. This is how it works out. So we do have it's fact that the high income earners are already paying a substantially larger burden of the total tax than the low income earners. Okay, so with that being said, what is the rationale and then possibly the effect applying that supply side tax theory, which would be let's reduce the tax rates and see what that does to the incentives of people to earn and invest, to do the things that generate income, right? What generates income? Working, investing, starting a business, trying to innovate new technology to make your business more profitable and efficient. And the whole idea of supply side tax theory is that if tax rates are too high, people's incentives to do those things are kind of quashed. And therefore, if we lower tax rates, people's incentives to do those things, to be productive and earn income, will increase. And we might see a higher rate of growth and productivity and efficiency in the economy, again, shifting the supply curves for all those different goods and services to the right. Okay, so here's supply side tax theory in a nutshell. Economists like to say if you tax something, you get less of it. So the reverse of that holds true as well. If you eliminate taxes or even just reduce tax rates or tax burdens, you'll get more of that thing. Specifically here, we're talking about the income tax. So if you tax income at higher rates, you'll get people earning less because they work less or invest less or start fewer businesses. And conversely, if you cut tax rates, you'll have people working more, investing more, starting more businesses, which could contribute to more economic growth, more productivity, more goods available at lower prices. Let's just summarize that. The supply siders say if you have high tax rates in particular, so we're talking about the income tax now, people have incentives to work, invest, and earn less. There's going to be less overall output and wealth. And possibly or even likely there's going to be less overall tax collected, and we'll get to that here in a minute. We need to think about the elasticity of income with respect to the tax rate, which is a fancy way of saying like how much more will people work or invest or start businesses based on a given reduction of the current tax rate. And we don't know exactly, so that's going to be an empirical question, meaning that we have to look at some data, we have to look at some history and some data and test that. The good news for us is we have 100 plus years of income tax records in the United States, and we've had distinct eras of very high tax rates in the United States, and we've had relatively low tax rates in the United States. So it's a really good field to go and collect the data and try to see how the effects play out, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this all. Right. Now, another thing is that if you have high tax rates, not only will people work, invest, and earn less, but they'll also try to shelter with the income that they do have from taxation. And in particular, high income earners, who we've already established pay the vast bulk of the taxes, well, they will have the strongest incentives to shelter income because they're the ones getting hit hardest by taxation. So they're going to do a couple things, and the literature on this is very abundantly clear that when tax rates go up, rich people, high income people, let's say, will do these two things in particular. They will try to up their expenses as much as possible so they have less reportable income, and they can do that by basically just spending more on the comfort or ease of their jobs, so to speak. So you'll see things like really nice offices, a lot of business trips, a lot of expense accounts spending. Businesses will install a lot of art. They'll make the amenities at the office really nice. The goal of that is basically to take the income rather than in a paycheck, to take it kind of in perks or amenities at your work. So the other thing people will do is put money in tax-free investments, and the biggest one of those is in U.S. history is municipal bonds. Bonds, borrowing by state governments, local governments, are exempt from taxation. So when you have high tax rates, rich people, instead of investing their money in the stock market or instead of pooling funds to invest in real estate development or things like that, they'll park a lot of their money in municipal bonds. Okay, so the overall result then with higher marginal tax rates is we're probably going to have less investment, fewer jobs because there's less money being put into businesses and fewer businesses being started, and therefore lower overall growth. Okay, so coming back to supply side tax policy. Now, we might say, well, what is the goal of taxes? Okay, and there's really two things to think about here. It's not so simple as, well, we just want to raise money to fund the government. That's the obvious thing, but there's a deeper thing here, and it's going to depend on people's political leanings. Because some people think about taxes in this way. They want to punish the rich, or they want to level the playing field, or they want equity, let's say, between the high earners and low earners. So if that's the mentality here, they're probably okay with high tax rates, less income and less government revenue and growth, because their goal with the taxes is not to promote economic growth. Their goal is to promote some kind of vision of fairness or equity. Their goal is to level the playing field between high earners and low earners, let's say. So they're going to tax high income people and maybe try to spend that money through government programs to help low income people. You could call this like the Robin Hood model of taxation. You tax the rich, you give to the poor. On the other hand, you've got the supply siders who are explicit that they want to tax policy, sure, to fund the government, but also to promote economic growth and investment in jobs and capital formation. And for them, high tax rates are going to be a problem. In fact, the biggest problem of all. And they're going to look to cut taxes in order to incentivize people to work more and start businesses and earn more and grow the economy. So when we talk about supply side policy, it's like, as I noted earlier, there's other things other than tax rate policy, but supply side policy is kind of first and foremost focused on taxation and tax rates. So it's almost redundant to say supply side tax policy. We might just say supply side policy. Now, let me take a few minutes to dig back through the history of supply side economics. And the history of supply side economics, we could probably take this back at least 200 years to some of the great classical economists. I think you could find some supply side economics in Adam Smith in the late 1700s. You could definitely find some great supply side economics in Jean Baptiste Say, the great French classical economist in the early 1800s. And then going forward, you'd find what we would now label supply side economics throughout the classical and then the marginalists and the modern economists. But I want to focus on U.S. history and specifically the U.S. tax system, because almost as long as we have had an income tax in the United States since 1913, we've also had supply side arguments about what tax rates ought to be. So here's a little bit of a historical overview of supply side tax thinking in U.S. history. Now we'll do this as kind of as a little game. I'm going to show you a quote and then you guess who the government official or politician is who said that quote. Let's start with this. Congress might well consider whether the higher rates of income and profits taxes can in peace times be effectively productive of revenue, and whether they may not, on the contrary, be destructive of business activity and productive of waste and inefficiency. There is a point at which, in peace times, high rates of income and profits taxes discourage energy, remove the incentive to new enterprise, encourage extravagant expenditures, and produce industrial stagnation with consequent unemployment and other attendant evils. That's a classic supply side argument that's saying tax rates are too high and we need to reduce tax rates in order to have a stronger economy. Who said this? Woodrow Wilson, a progressive Democrat, in fact, kind of the leader of the progressive movement in the Democrat Party in the early 1900s, two-term president before and during World War I. So probably the last person a lot of people would expect to be associated with a supply side way of thinking about tax policy. But when the U.S. entered World War I, the income tax was brand new, and tax rates went from, I believe the top rate was 6% or maybe 7% before World War I, and they were ratcheted all the way up to 73% by the end of World War I, so 1918, 1919. And even the Democrats, who were very pro-income tax, looked at that and said, maybe these really high tax rates are discouraging people with wealth from investing and growing the economy. So Wilson, I think, smartly acknowledged the problem of high taxes. He didn't, though, promote consequent tax cutting policy. Let's skip ahead a little bit. Here's another quote. These taxpayers are withdrawing their capital. We're talking about high income earners. They're withdrawing their capital from productive business and investing it instead in tax exempt securities. That would be those municipal bonds I mentioned. And adopting other lawful methods of tax avoidance, basically spending a lot of money inside the business to reduce the reported net income. The result is to stop business transactions and to discourage men of wealth from taking the risks which are incidental to the development of new business. The only way to save the situation is to put the taxes on a reasonable basis that will permit business to go on and industry to develop. And when this person says put taxes on a reasonable basis, he's talking about cutting tax rates a lot. This would be this guy right here, whom you've probably never heard of, but a very important person in American economics, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. He was a Secretary of the Treasury for Presidents Harding and Coolidge in the 1920s. And he was one of the biggest advocates and one of the earliest advocates of supply-side tax policy. And because Andrew Mellon was Secretary of the Treasury and he was very well respected in the government, and he had the backing of President Coolidge in particular, he was able to promote, and Congress then implemented a massive tax cutting plan in the 1920s. And by 1925, Mellon's plan, which was passed by Congress and signed by President Coolidge, got that top rate down from what it had been, 73% back in Woodrow Wilson's presidency, down to 25%. And this arguably contributed to the economic boom in the 1920s known as the Roaring Twenties. Tax rates came down a lot. Rich people with money said, hey, investing pays off a lot more than it used to, and a lot of economic growth, a lot of jobs, a lot of capital formation ensued. All right, let's skip ahead a little bit further. Here's a good quote from a supply sider. It says, our tax system still siphons out of the private economy too large a share of personal and business purchasing power and reduces the incentive for risk, investment, and effort, thereby aborting our recoveries and stifling our national growth rate. A tax cut means higher family income and higher business profits and a balanced federal budget. Every taxpayer and his family will have more money left over after taxes for a new car, a new home, new conveniences, education, and investment. Every businessman can keep a higher percentage of his profits in his cash register or put it to work, expanding or improving his business. And as the national income grows, the federal government will ultimately end up with more revenues. That would be this guy right here, another Democrat, President John Kennedy, 1963. Unfortunately, Kennedy was murdered before he was able to implement his tax cutting plan, but his tax cutting plan had already been introduced in Congress. He was a strong cheerleader for it, and after his death, President Johnson took over and signed the tax cut program that was initially passed by Congress, I believe, before the end of 1963, and then was finalized, I want to say, in 1964 under President Johnson. So this is often referred to as the Kennedy/Johnson tax cut. But the tax rates were brought down significantly here, and that arguably contributed to a very strong economic boom for the rest of the 1960s. So we're kind of seeing history repeat itself. Taxes go up to pay for a war that happened in World War I. Supply side reformers say, hey, tax rates are too high, they're stifling investment and growth, they cut the taxes, we get a boom. Well, come the 1930s, people like Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrat-controlled Congress pushed the tax rates back up during World War II. In the early 1940s, tax rates went up even higher because the government needs money to pay for the war. So tax rates go up again. The economy's kind of stagnant. Supply-side reformer comes along, cuts the taxes, the economy booms. So even already by the 1960s, we've seen this tax cut, tax hike cycle play out several times, and we're kind of only getting started here. Let's do a couple more. With our budget cuts, we've presented a complete program of reduction in tax rates. Again, our purpose was to provide incentive for the individual, incentives for businesses, to encourage production and hiring of the unemployed, and to free up money for investment. Another famous supply sider, you probably recognize him, Ronald Reagan, president from 81 to 89. And one of the first things he did when he went into office was to promote a pretty big tax cutting plan. The first sequence of those tax cuts was enacted right after he made this speech. This speech was made on national TV to promote the tax cut plan. It did sail through Congress. And then in 1986, I believe, an even more comprehensive tax cut plan that was promoted by Reagan also passed through Congress. So Reagan did kind of the thing that Coolidge had done, stepped taxes down quite a bit in multiple moves through his tenure, and arguably this contributed to a very strong economic boom in the 1980s. And a lot of people say the boom initiated during the Reagan presidency lasted probably well into the 2000s, maybe with just a few minor recessions along the way. Okay, and here's one more. The corporate tax rate, as you know, will be lowered from 35 to 21%. That means that more products will be made in the USA. A lot of things are going to be happening in the USA. We're going to bring back our companies. Historic small business tax cuts and pass-throughs now are made really, really good for the business owner. They're hiring people. The small business tax cut and the pass-throughs are now really incentivizing people. And the bottom line is, this is the biggest tax cuts and reform in the history of our country. This is bigger than, actually, President Reagan's many years ago. I'm very honored by it. If you've been paying attention to politics in the U.S. in the past few years, you probably know who this is. That bravado, it's got to be this guy, President Trump. So President Trump also applying that supply side type thinking, because after the Reagan tax cuts, subsequent presidents, almost all of them actually, kind of gradually ratcheted tax rates back up. And Trump in particular was focused on the corporate income tax rate. His plan also, though, reduced and simplified the tax rates and brackets for individual income taxes as well. So very explicit with the supply side arguments there. We cut tax rates, we're going to have more investment, more capital formation, more jobs created, more economic growth, and so on. Now, a lot of the critics of supply side policy that are either kind of focused not so much on the economic incentive effects of taxation, and they're more concerned about, quote, fairness or equity or what have you. So not necessarily an economic growth argument, not necessarily a macro argument, but the people who maybe do acknowledge the incentive effects and the pro-growth effects of tax cuts, they'll say, but if we cut taxes, we might see larger government deficits because that would mean the government's collecting less money. If the tax rate goes down, the rich don't pay as much taxes, right? Right? Well, actually, the answer is not necessarily. And in many cases, when tax rates go down, tax collection goes up. And that has something to do with what's popularly known nowadays as the Laffer curve. So let me introduce you to one of my favorite economists, and really kind of the name and face that's almost representative of supply side economics in the United States for the past 40 years. That's Arthur Laffer. So Laffer was a prominent economist way back as far as the 1970s. He worked for President Nixon. In the early 70s, he worked for President Trump just recently. He was a professor at the University of Chicago, University of Southern California, very prominent, very well known. So anyway, Laffer was part of this kind of supply side revolution, which they didn't invent supply side economics. They basically just resurrected it in the 1970s during the era when tax rates went up. So this is post the Kennedy Johnson tax cuts. And in addition to the kind of incentive arguments that were standard with supply side thinking, Laffer was really big on kind of bringing back the idea that if you cut taxes, if tax rates are really high and you cut them, you actually might see increase in government revenue rather than a reduction. So this is a kind of an artifact of that. The description here, this is from the National Archives, says that in 1974, economist Art Laffer sketched a new direction for the Republican Party on this napkin. Displeased with President Gerald Ford's decision to raise taxes to control inflation, four men got together at a Washington, D.C. restaurant to think about alternatives. Laffer was joined by journalist Jude Wanniski and politicians Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld. Names you might remember: Dick Cheney was vice president, Don Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush. Laffer argued that lowering taxes would increase economic activity. Wanniski popularized the theory, and politicians Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney carried it out. Well, they helped to carry it out. They helped promote tax cuts later on during the Reagan years in particular. The cloth napkin was taken as a souvenir by Jude Wanniski. The napkin reads, quote, "If you tax a product, less results. If you subsidize a product, more results." And he means their production. "We've been taxing work, output, and income, and subsidizing non-work, leisure, and unemployment. The consequences are obvious." With an image of the Laffer curve in the middle, the bottom of the napkin reads, "To Don Rumsfeld at our two continents rendezvous, 9/13/74, Art Thurby Laffer." So kind of a famous description. Now, what does the Laffer curve itself mean? Well, let's watch this little video clip from Laffer himself, because nobody explains it better than he does.
So you asked me, what is the Laffer curve? Now, in all honesty, the Laffer curve, as you may see, is my profile, but no, it's not. The Laffer curve is the relationship between tax rates and total tax revenues. And by the way, I did not name it the Laffer curve, and it's been around for centuries and centuries. In fact, the first reference to it I really know is in the Muqaddimah. In 1381, Ibn Khaldun described it this way: at the beginning of dynasties, tax rates are low and revenues are high. At the end of dynasties, tax rates are high and revenues are low. That's the sort of logic behind it. But let me, if I can, say, how much would you work if you were taxed at 100%? So that every time you go to the office, instead of getting a check, you get a bill. Obviously, you wouldn't work at all, and there'd be no work, but also the tax revenues would be zero. Now, that's this point right here on the Laffer curve. At 100% tax rates, no one will find there's any incentive whatsoever to work. They won't work, and tax revenues will be zero as well. Now, as you start lowering tax rates to 99, to 98, to 97, somewhere along the line, all of a sudden, you're going to find it worthwhile to start working, and you're going to see revenues starting to rise. The other point of the Laffer curve that's fixed is at zero tax rates. At zero tax rates, if there are no taxes, of course the government's not going to collect any revenues. We're going to have a lot of output, employment, and production, but there'll be no revenues, and that's this point down here. And again, at this point, if they start raising tax rates, as they start raising tax rates, what you're going to find is the revenues are going to increase, but they will increase at slower and slower rates. And these two curves will come at a point, the maximum point out here. Now, the key thing about the Laffer curve that makes it fairly interesting for politicians is to remember it's a pedagogic device, not an explicit measure of any one country. But what it does show you is that there are two tax rates that give the same amount of revenue. There's a high tax rate and a low tax rate. No country should ever want to be in that high tax rate range. I mean, why would you ever want a tax at this point where if you lowered tax rates, you collected more money and you have more output, employment, and production? So this is the Laffer curve, which really brings together the debate about taxes. There are two effects taxes have on revenues. Number one, which we call the arithmetic effect. If you raise tax rates, you do collect more revenue per dollar of tax base. That's the arithmetic effect. But there's also the economic effect, which if you increase tax rates, you reduce the attractiveness of doing the activity, and you will shrink the tax base. These two effects, the arithmetic effect and the economic effect, always work in the opposite direction. In this range, the arithmetic effect wins, and you get more revenues by raising tax rates. In this range, the economic effect wins, which by raising tax rates, you actually get less revenues because you do more and more damage to the tax base. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Laffer curve. Thank you.
So let's just recap what Professor Laffer said there. So we've got the tax rate on the vertical axis, and that starts at zero and can, I mean, theoretically as high as 100%. And then on the horizontal axis is the revenue collected by the government. So as Laffer explains there, as the tax rate goes up away from zero, so if the tax rate was only 2, 3, 4, 5%, if the tax rate's 5%, you get to keep 95 cents on the dollar of your earnings. So you're probably going to do a lot of work, and the government will be able to implement that tax and not discourage people too much from working or investing, and they'll collect more revenue as that rate goes up. In fact, that'll grow pretty quickly, right? But then, so Laffer noted that this is the arithmetic effect. The rate's higher, they take more and more of people's earnings, so revenue will rise. But at some point, as that rate gets higher, the growth in earnings starts to taper off, and then it'll kind of max out. And that's what the point we're interested in. At what point do we turn around? We kind of turn the corner here, and as Laffer noted, you go from the arithmetic effect, and as rates get higher and higher, people say, you know what, I'm not going to work so much or invest so much because the government's taking more and more of my earnings. And then it starts to bend back like this, and of course, once we get to 100%, it goes back to zero. So the question is, so there's a break point here, and Laffer calls this range up here, the effect up here, he called it the economic effect. I like to call it the incentive effect, but same type of thing, right? Economics is about opportunity cost and incentives. So we've got the economic effect dominating in this range, and if you raise taxes here, you get less revenue. Down here, if you raise taxes, you get more revenue. So the big question is, what is the turning point here, right? What is this point right here where your revenue would be maximized at this tax rate. Now, this is kind of an open question, and the only way to find this out, and it would be specific for each country and each time and place, would be to, well, run different tax rates and see which one maximizes revenue. Now, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury back in the 1920s, really smart guy, and I think he just kind of had a sense that that's probably somewhere around 25%. So probably the lower end of that would be 25%. I think Laffer and the current supply siders would maybe put that into the 35 to 40% range. Right now, the top tax rate is 37%. So I would say that those are probably the boundaries, just in my kind of professional opinion. You don't want the top tax rate higher than the high 30s. You probably get into that prohibitive range. Laffer called this up here the prohibitive range of the Laffer curve. By that, he means that that's prohibitive in terms of the government collecting more revenue with higher tax rates. Let me close out this discussion with reference to a book that I read recently that I really enjoyed. It was by Art Laffer and two of his colleagues, economic historians and researchers, Brian Dimitrovic and Jean Karen Sinkfield. And this is called Taxes Have Consequences: An Income Tax History of the United States. The book chronicles income tax from its beginning in 1913 all the way up through 2022. I believe the book was released in late 22, and lays out 5 distinct rate cut episodes. I mentioned several of these. The book really digs through the data, and it's very well researched. I endorse this book. I recommend this book. I think it's an excellent book. And it lays out, I think, irrefutable historical facts that after each tax cut, we had strong economic performance, meaning above average growth, below average unemployment, and also increased government revenue. So it seemed to be that every time taxes were cut significantly in U.S. history, we were probably up in that prohibitive range of the Laffer curve. And what the government did by cutting taxes was push us down here closer to that optimum point, right? And here's just a good takeaway quote from the book. They say, "We find that the evidence indicates, again, in case after case, that lower tax rates have resulted in economic growth, employment, and the broadening of opportunity," end quote. Now let me make just a final comment on that. Is the fact that government revenue went up after a tax cut, is that dispositive proof of the Laffer curve, that we were in the prohibitive range? No. It could be the case that tax collections might have gone up if the rates hadn't been changed, or even if the rates had been increased. So, as with any research, as with any study, there's always confounding factors. There's always other things that could be going on that the research doesn't necessarily capture. So you can be skeptical, and you, of course, can also have just a different ideology or a different set of preferences regarding the tax system and a different way of thinking about it. I will state for the record and for full disclosure that I consider myself a supply sider and adherent and advocate of supply side thinking. And indeed, I've had the privilege of having met and conversed with Professor Laffer in person. Got a photo op with him. He's a swell guy. I think even if you disagree with his economics, if you met him in person, he's just a really nice and charming guy, and you probably would respect him as a person, and you could respectfully disagree with his analysis. But I am convinced by his analysis. I've read his book, I've reviewed his book, and I endorse the supply side tax program altogether. So that's where I stand on taxes. You can have your own opinions, of course, but this is the supply side way of thinking. So hope you've enjoyed this. I'll see you next time.